Custom resource definition. What is this and how does it work? Kubernetes is popular because it is composable, right? You can add your own resources if you want to. There are many resources, like we've seen many different controllers, many different resources like deployment, use of daemon sets, stateful sets, or jobs and cron jobs. Each of them give you a different feature, right? It gives you an API object work you can create. You can define that specification, and it has its own spec. The way you define it, you create that object, and that gets stored where in our cluster data store in HCD. And you can see those objects by doing maybe get, create, list, delete, whatever you want to, right? You can also create resources which are not built in, which are not default. Like you have deployment, you have daemon sets. You want to have your own custom resources. You can write that. How do we do that is what we look at in the CRD section, right? Say for example, I want to have an just give me 1 second. Just trying to find something. I want to create my own resource. I can, right? We created a job right now, and then it had its own specification. We mentioned that when we did the apply, it created an object and it's stored in your HCD database, and then there was a controller behind it. Stepping back, the kube controller manager, what we looked at in the architecture point, we said there's another component called as controller. What does it do? Every controller has a specific job to do, right? It runs an infinite loop, and then it constantly keeps an eye on your cluster. The job of that is to look at what your desired state is and observe what your current state of your cluster is and determine any differences. If there are, reconcile your cluster towards your desired state. That logic, that program is what it runs in the background. When I say I want to create a deployment, it has its own specification. When I create that, mentioning the template, spec, replicas, whatever, it gets created in your database. Just creating that resource is not going to work. There is a controller associated with it. There's a program associated with that, which is running in an infinite loop, which is monitoring and getting to work and trying to respond to events. You change your desired state, that controller is keeping an eye, and it goes and does what it needs to do. There's a logic, there's a program behind it, which does that. Similar way, you can create your own resources. Like the way deployment, it has its specification for 3 things: replicas, selectors, and template. You want to create your own resources, you can do that. And you can also write, just creating those resources is of no help for you, because it's just going to get created as an object and get stored in the HCD database. Once it's there, we want an associated controller to be kicked in, which is going to go look at what it needs to do and goes ahead and creates it. Say, for example, I want to have my own resources. When I do kubectl API resources, it shows us what all kind of API resources we can create, right? My font size is all over the place, but then if you look at it, in the current versions, I can do many things like pods, replica set, deployment, jobs, cron jobs, HPA, right? I want to have my own. You can do that. Say, I want to, maybe let me, I want to have my own resource created. Say I have API version. Let me do this. We have, I want to create my own resource. Say, for example, like this, we want to create something called as K21 training. There's a group called as k21training.com, and the API version is v1. And the kind what I want to do is maybe K21 training. So when I create this object, I want it to go and do certain things. So we will see what it is. And under spec, I want to have maybe, I have defined my own fields, like maybe I want to create a Kubernetes course, and instructor is another field what we have. I want to create my own resource. I can do so. But right now, when I save this and try to apply it, it's going to come back and tell me what is this kind. There's nothing called as K21 kind because I don't have it as part of the API resources. It is not going to work for you. But what I'm trying to show you is we want a new resource to be created, which should look like this. When I create an object this way, and I have built in a controller in the backend, what I want it to do is when I specify some resource that is created on a cluster, it should read the information from here, and it should go in the backend, and maybe if there's an API exposed, goes to our k21training.com and automatically sign me up for a course called as Kubernetes, which the instructor is Rohan, and the weekend batch. I want it to automatically do that. And I say I want to delete this, and it's going to automatically should go ahead and back in the backend cancel it. I want to edit and modify it. You should be able to modify and do any of those. Right? You can create your own custom resources this way. And I may save this right now and go back and try to rename this guy. When I do kubectl apply from file, my resource, it's going to tell me, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, but there is no version called as K21. There is no group called as, K21training.com, right? But I wanted it this way. So what can I do? I wanted to have my own resource, like this resource has its own spec, like how deployment had its own. I have job had its own, cron job had its own spec. I want to create my own resource this way. When I do that, it should go ahead and book the course for me in the backend. You can define resources like this based on your use case. For this to be stored in the HCD, we need to have something called as custom resource definition. We need to define what this is, how this should look like, what should be the spec of it. We need to define all of that. We can create any resource, literally anything. Like I just created something called as k21training.com. I wanted to a class to be booked, and when I delete that kind, delete the resource, the class should be automatically cancelled. Whatever I wanted to, right? By just creating it this way, it's not definitely going to book a class for me. But if k21.com has an API exposure, there may be some https book-training.com/API, stuff like that, which we can call, and then which we can then book the class. That is where your controller comes into picture. So you need to have a controller created. When I create a custom resource this way, it's just going to sit out there in the database, not going to do anything. But I also write a controller, maybe using Python or Golang or any of that, and where I have built in a logic. When you see an resource with the kind K21 of K20 training created, and this is what you should do: take these features, go do the booking, get back and give the answer, stuff like that, right? Just like when you create a deployment, it's going to create that object in your database, and that's where it's the deployment controller kicks in and come back and says, okay, this is what I need to do, this is the replica, this is the template, this is how I need to create. It gets to work and does that, right? And if you just git clone maybe the Kubernetes/Kubernetes, if you go to Git repository, you will find all of the source code. And if you just go inside and find for maybe deployment controller.go, you will find that program, that controller, the deployment controller written in the Golang, which has the logic built in. That is when you create a kind called as deployment, and whatever specification it does, it knows what it needs to do in the backend because there is a logic, there's a controller built into it. And there's of course the definition of your resource of how it should look like, feel like is also defined. The deployment is part of your Kubernetes core source code, so you don't need to worry about it. But I have some other requirement, something like this. What do I need to do? This resource itself is not there, so I need to create a custom resource definition making use of an API called as API extension. I'm telling my Kubernetes, hey, I want to create my own resource, which has a definition like this. This is the name, this is the spec and spec. When we do recursive of deployment or any pod spec, what do we find? Whatever spec we can have, it tells you what kind of option it is. Is it a kind? Is it a, sorry, is it a string? Is it a Boolean? Is it an integer? Right? I can tell my Kubernetes what I want. I want to create a custom resource where this I want to add a new API group and I want to add a kind. When I say kubectl get, I want to use the short name. When you do API resources, it shows you all of that: the short name, the plural name, the singular name, and whatever components you can define under that. I want to define all of that. I want to have another resource for myself this way. I want to set up my own kind called as K21 training. I can do that with the help of custom resource definition. All right. So where do we go? We go look at the documentation. I want to create something called as a custom resource definition. CRD is a short for that. It tells you if Kubernetes can be, are extensions of API. You can add your own custom resources, right? Just adding that custom resource is not going to help you. You need to also have the logic, the source code behind it, so that it can go do the work for you. First, let's try to create that resource, and then we will see how to write the Golang code and spin up the controller. All right. And if I scroll down, it gives me a long story, but it says you can create your new custom resource definition. Short for that is CRD. And you can define every option what you have inside that, and define how does it look like. This is exactly how a CRD would look like. We will copy this exactly from here. We'll to go ahead and create what we wanted to create. I will paste the same thing. We'll go back and modify it. Right now, we wanted to create our own custom resource definition. The kind is custom resource definition, and we have to mention the name of it, name of the custom resource what we're trying to create. And name has to be following an order. Name must be matching the spec fields below, should be in the form of plurals dot the group. The group is what did we give. Maybe let me open a duplicate session real quick. The group what I gave is k21training.com, right? And the name it says plural dot the group. So I'm going to delete this. What is it plural? We will come to that in a couple of seconds. I will call the plural as K21 trading dot the group name. I'm going to paste it to avoid. That is the name of the custom resource what I'm trying to create, right? Under the groups, which is that API group I wanted to, we look at the API, different API groups what we have. We're creating our own group called as K21training.com API group, right? And that API, which version it should be. You can have multiple versions. We're going to look at the API versions next when we do the deprecation part of it. We have seen this so far, like you have deployment belongs to the group called as apps and version as V1. Few releases before 1.18, 1.17, it used to be V1 beta 1, right? You have V1 alpha 1 beta, and then from alpha it graduates to beta, from beta it goes to general availability, where you drop that alpha and beta words out there, right? That is the exactly the version is all about. So I'm creating a kind, the group name is k21training.com and the version is v1. There's also the persistence and the storage of it. There are two options. uh, we will talk about that when we go to the, sorry, I lost a thought. Anyway, served is the one which tells you by default if this version is enabled or not. So if you can have the same resource like v1 or v2 or v1 alpha 1 beta 1, which is the version it needs to be enabled, is what it tells you. Right now we are creating only one version. This needs to be enabled. And storage is in which format it needs to be stored when it's stored in the HCD, right? That is what it means when we see what version is that. And we make use of schema. It belongs to the open API v3 schema. This is where you define different R components what you had, right? The type is object. Under spec, what we define is different properties. We had one property called as what? Course, right? and we say, what is it? Is it an integer? Is it a Boolean field? Is it, string? Course is what I have is string. And next what we had was instructor. That is also a type of string. And then next what we had was batch. That is also of the type string. We will change it to string. So under schema, we have defined whatever the spec templates, what do they look like, right? And then a resource can be scope can be namespaced. When you do kubectl API resource, it shows you it is namespaced or not. Like pods, your network policies, your deployments are all scope namespaced. Your components like your PVs and other things which are non-namespaced, right? So whatever what I'm creating, is it namespaced or not? Uh, is this field? Two options you have: namespace or cluster. Cluster means it is cluster wide. It is scope to a namespace. What your resource you create to create, you can mention it as namespace. And the names you have few options, like you have plural options. When you do kubectl APIs and get APIs, so kubectl API resources, the way it lists out is in the plural form, and that's exactly what we made use of it in the beginning as well. I'm going to copy it from there. This object name I want to give it as this way, singular. When you do kubectl get, this is what it's going to show you from the CLI point of view. How do you want to look like? The kind, what did we define in the kind? The kind we defined as K21 training with T capital, and we can define it this way. You want to have any short name, like for example, kubectl get pods. The short for pods is what? PO, short for service, SVC, right? If you want to define any short names, maybe I want to define something called as maybe KT. You can define your custom resource this way. It's scope, namespace, how do you want to call it, plural, singular, the kind, what should look like, the short name, what should look like, and what schema you're making use of under the spec, whatever properties you are defining under the spec, how should they look like? What are those? Are they object? Are they, an array, or just a string or an integer or a Boolean? You can define all of them, right? Which, how many versions you have, you can define them. This version is going to be the default version, or this is the version in which the format is going to be stored. You can define that as a storage versions as well. Which group name it belongs to, you can create that. Name of the custom resource, what you define. The kind, what you created, is the custom resource definition. So we're going to save this. We want to go back and do kubectl apply from file this CRD. We created our own custom resource definition called as k21training.com. Now, if I do kubectl get me, show me the CRD, it tells you you have a kind, a custom resource definition, what you've created yourself called as kubectl. Can you show me any kind of this? They're not there. Now, if I go back and apply kubectl apply from file my src, let me open this. What have we defined is a kind called as K21 training. Earlier, when we tried to do that, it said, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no version called as K21training.com. There is no kind called as K21 training and stuff like that. Right now that we have created a custom resource definition, we have told we have added this API group, we have created this kind, and if I go back and do it right now, it's going to allow me to create this kind. It says a K21training.com kind called as my resource, my course got created. Right? Kubectl get is going to show you that information. Describe is going to show you a little bit of information. What we've created. Let me do a describe as well. Then we move forward. What fields you have and stuff like that. Now this information is gone and stored in your etcd. So when this is exactly the way we created deployment, for example, right? We defined the spec, we said create a deployment. It came back and told us a deployment created. You do get, you do describe, you do delete. It shows you all of that. It is stored as an object where in your etcd. right? And now we did the same thing. We created a custom resource definition. We defined how our resource should look like. We did that with with the help of extension called as CRD, custom resource definition. In that, we defined what the name of that is, what is the scope, what group it belongs to, what version it belongs to, what are the specs inside that. We defined all of it. But just creating this resource is doing nothing, right? Right now, it is created. I can view it. I can do whatever I want, but that is not the whole story. Correct? It is just getting stored in the HCD right now. That's what it's doing. That's all it is. It is stored in my HCD. I can do an edit. It opens and tells you this is what it is. But we have not defined any logic. We do not have any logic built in. There's no controller built in the backend which can go work, do something on it. So just defining the custom resource. This is how you can add your own resources is what I showed you. But you need to write the logic. Some controller which is going to keep an infinite loop in watch continuously when you create a resource like this and get to work and do what it's supposed to do. But we need to define that. We need to add that logic. We need to write the program. And without the controller, CRD will do nothing. It just sits out there. It gets stored in a CD. That's all it does, right? So you got to write your code right where whatever language you're comfortable with, Python or any of those. Write those infinite loops, tell what it needs to look at and what where it needs to go do what it needs to do. You need to define all of that. That is where your controllers come into picture. You need to create your custom controllers, and you can make use of, since Kubernetes is built in Golang, if you are good at Golang, you can make use of Golang and you can write your controller, right? And what is that is going to do is when you create a resource this way, it is going to go and act on that. The custom controller is going to monitor this object and watch and perform the actions like I modify it, I delete it, and stuff like that. It is going to respond to those changes. Less like I update the replica account, deployment will scale up. I delete it, I update it, I change the image. There is a controller which is keeping a constant eye, which is working in the back end behind the scene. Same thing, same story here as well. We created our custom resource, but we also need a controller. What do I do for that? You need to write your own code. I don't know how to write Golang. Fine, can't help you if you don't know what to write the code yet. You can create your own custom controllers, right? And it gives you uh, just trying to find an example what you have here. You have something called a sample. Let me search here. There you go. What Kubernetes does, it gives you a sample controller. It gives you a framework where you don't have to do much of changes. You can download this. Let me quickly do that for you. Let me copy this repository, clone that. Awesome. It gives you a framework. It gives you an option like it's written in Golang. It gives you can create your own controllers and then you can make use of your Go build commands and build it. Just open a sample controller here. This is how your Golang code would look like, right? This is where you define the different packages, what you have defined, what it should look like. When I say course is equal to Kubernetes, what it should go, where it should go. When I say batch is equal to evening, what it should do. When I say delete, what it should do. When I say create, edit, what it needs to do. The sample code is given to you here as a sample controller. And if you understand the Golang and if you know how to modify it, you can define, you make use of this template framework and fix it. Like this is an example of a deployment here, where under deployment spec, if you have replicas, it tells you what it needs to do, and there's the logic written, right? Exactly the same way you can write your own controller. Just having the custom resource not going to help me. I need to also write a controller. Once I write the controller, once I customize to make use of this sample I have, and then I can also build it, or maybe just do a go build and run it as a controller, just like this as a binary here, or I can package it as an image and run it as a pod. Which one runs that? We looked at the ingress controller. Remember, We did the ingress a few weeks back, and then that ingress controller runs as a pod, runs as a deployment, right? They bundled all of that logic code, what they had, they built an application, bundled it as an image, gave the YAML for us. We deployed that. That Nginx ingress controller was running as a pod on our cluster. Same story, right? That was another controller which was built, and this is how you would build your own controller as well. What did we look at? We looked at custom resource definition. We built that. Then we understand the logic is we need to have a controller behind the scene to do that. There are few controllers already available, right? And the story behind that is operators. Your custom resource definitions plus your custom controller is your operator. Using it's a framework. It gives you a framework. Then you can deploy both your custom resource definition and your custom controller together, right? And there are few community driven controllers available out there. You can go back and look at the operator hub. And there are few custom resource definitions defined, and there are the controllers built in by your community. For example, what can we choose? Maybe I will choose this, something randomly, right? And it tells you, it adds some extension, add some additional feature for your Kubernetes cluster, and you want to install it. It's very simple. It tells you you can install your operator lifecycle manager and then download this YAML file. It is going to set up that custom resource definition for you and the controller in behind the scene. What is the story of operator? Why do we need an operator? Operators are similar to your human operators. Say, for example, there's a controller for HCD. What would a database admin do? Right? He would take a backup. He would monitor, and maybe if it fails, it restore. He will, create that stuff like that. Right? Operator patterns are something similar. It aims to capture whatever your human operator does, and repetitive tasks can be automated. And how do you do that? By creating your custom resource and writing a logic behind it called as custom controller. Combination of those two is your operator. So it gives you an example as well, like some of things your operator, what you automate wants to maybe deploy the application, take backups, handle upgrades, whatever based on your application. Right? For example, you have a HCD operator where you have defined your own custom resource definitions, like what, create cluster, take backup, do restore, and you have logic built into it. You have custom controllers built into it. When you say create backup, there's a backup controller. When you say restore backup, there's a restore controller, right? And together is what is your operator framework. From the exam point of view, of course, you're not needed to write the operator code. You're not expected to be an expert in Golang. Neither you're expected to go to some website and download your operators. And an operator is not part of the syllabus anyways. Because we looked at CRDs, I brought this out. And from the CRD point of view, just UK, there's no question yet. But if there is one, we don't need to worry about it. We kind of understand right now. I don't know if there is an activity guide. If not, I can share the history what I've done with you. And what we need to understand is how to build this. What we looked at it is pretty elementary stuff where we defined our own resource. How do we want it to look like is what you do. You extend, there's an example here. We took the same example, we modified to meet our need. Like I said, just creating a custom resource is of it doesn't really help you, because you need to have that custom controller built in the backend so that it can do the work for you. All right, question time. That's the reason I did the CRD in the last, because there's not much of there's not, you're expected to know about this, and you're not expected to write any controller, not expected to write any CRDs from the exam point of view. But what CRD is and how you can extend is what you should know. And we just made use of a simple example, and we created our own custom resource, our own kind, our own API version out there. We defined all of that with the help of a custom resource definition. We created that kind which got persisted in my database. Just persisting in the database is no good for me until unless there's no backend code, infinite loop, which looks at it and acts on it. That's your controller. Custom resource definition plus your controller is your operator framework, which is easy for you to most commonly used. Few of the operators out there are available. You can, instead of building it, you can just download and run it, which gets deployed on your cluster and runs as custom resource definitions out there. That was your CRD.